Abrams or some CIA person here had this plan, how can we find someone who we can buy off and there'll just be a name out there and we'll install ourselves with him as a figurehead? Is that what happened, and how long had this been planned for?
Yes, and I would urge folks to read Max Blumenthal in The Gray Zone. He's talked about this, that Guaido had been cultivated for some time to essentially be the opponent to Maduro, even amongst the opposition, he wasn't well known and was not a leader of the opposition. In fact, at the time he announced that he was president, he announced it at an opposition rally. You can see the video. Most of the people stood there shocked because they had no idea he was going to do it and they didn't support him. This was definitely a plan made in the United States. And again, Max Blumenthal at The Gray Zone really details how that plan came about.
I'm concerned about the sanctions. The sanctions seem to be killing as many people as wars. Are these sanctions legal? They're seizing bank accounts for Venezuela and things like that, seizing their oil and not paying for it. And the sanctions they're talking about sanctions against Russia, against Iran, against North Korea, Venezuela. I'm wondering if it could lead to a destruction of the dependency of countries on US dollar. I mean, people might start investing in Chinese currency because there's no risk that they're going to lose their money. We'll be coming up.
Yes. So first of all, you raised some very important issues. Number one, these sanctions are not lawful under international law. I would refer folks to Dr. Alfred de Zayas, who was the UN expert sent to Venezuela to look into the sanctions. He's written and spoken a lot about this issue. The sanctions violate a number of provisions of the UN Charter, including the provision that requires the Security Council to be in charge of international peace and security. It's the Security Council that should decide whether to impose sanctions or use force against another country for international peace and security. And I put those two together because, as you mentioned, these sanctions are a form of warfare. Let's be very clear about that. They do kill as many or more people than war. And we saw that with Iraq. You might recall that the sanctions against Iraq, even before the 2003 invasion, killed about 1 million Iraqis, including 500,000 children, right? And there's the famous question to Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State for Bill Clinton, who's asked, 500,000 children died due to these sanctions. Was it worth it? And she said, yes, it was worth it. So if you can kill 1 million people with sanctions, as you say, you can kill more people with sanctions than you can with bullets at times. And that is what's happening with Venezuela. And it is illegal. And as you know, the U.S. right now is sanctioning, according to the last estimate I saw, 36 different countries. And what it will do is sanction itself out of the world economy. Very soon, countries will not deal with the dollar, particularly in oil sales. Because, as you say, it's too risky. Why would you do that? You're going to be subject to all these sanctions, all this pressure. They're doing it not only against, our adversaries, but even our allies. We're threatening allies with these sanctions. For example, if they deal with Iran. People are not going to take this lightly. They don't like to be bullied. In the end, this is going to be counterproductive. And, in the meantime, kill a lot of people. I think he was up in there.
Let me,
Yeah.
it's not turned on.
Yeah, just flip it up, that's good.
Got it. I know you've worked with labor unions in Latin America, and we see a lot of refugees and a lot of asylees coming into the United States from different countries, a lot of times because of labor union repression. And in addition to stealing their resources, keeping people poor, keeping them unable to organize so that their jobs pay nothing, ultimately affects our country because these people basically will work for nothing because they come here and then they are competing with their jobs. But it seems to me that the analysis that we get leaves out the fact that the reason they don't get paid anything where they are is because we support the repression of their labor union. Wonder if you could say a few things about that and how it affects refugee flow, and especially which countries the refugees are coming from and what the labor practices are in those countries.
Yes, well, it is interesting. If you look at the statistics, the countries with the worst rates of violence against unionists on earth are Colombia, which has been number one for about 30 years. Over 4,000 union leaders have been killed in Colombia. 4,000! Guatemala is probably number 2 right now. Honduras is high. So these are U.S. allies in this hemisphere that have the highest rates of murder against unionists. And yes, of course, as you say, what this does is it artificially suppresses their wages and working conditions, and it leads to the impoverishment of the society, and as you say, the increase of economic refugees from those countries. And again, Colombia has really been the poster child for years for this, and it's the U.S.'s number 1 ally in the hemisphere. Along those lines, in addition to trade unionists are considered as human rights defenders in general. And I was reading Frontline Defenders, which is an organization which catalogs the number of human rights defenders killed and threatened around the world. Their latest report from last year found that there were about 310 human rights defenders killed in the world. Of those, 129 were Colombian. No country came close. And the ones after that were Brazil and Mexico. Again, very close U.S. allies. And these are facts, of course, you don't see every day. But again, these things are being done according to plan. As you mentioned, I'll give you an example of this. In Colombia, which some of you have heard of. So Chiquita Banana, which used to be United Fruit, you might have seen, in 2007, they pled guilty to providing $1.4 million and 3,000 Kalashnikov rifles to death squads in Colombia. Did you see that? At the time, the death squads were a designated terrorist organization by the United States State Department. So this was a crime. It'd be like giving money to Al-Qaeda. And so they pled guilty to doing this over a 7-year period. According to the Attorney General of Colombia, Mario Igueron, thousands of people were killed as a result of this help to the death squads. And according to the same Attorney General, Chiquita did it in order to make the Department of Yoruba safe for its banana production. In response, or in order to do this, they carried out mass murders of mostly Afro-Colombian people, by the way. So they pled guilty to this, and they had a very helpful defense lawyer, Eric Holder, who would become Attorney General for Barack Obama, who helped negotiate a great plea deal for them. For murdering thousands of people, they were given a fine of $25 million that they were allowed to pay over 5 years. No one went to jail. And the identity of the 8 officials of Chiquita involved in the payment scheme were kept secret, lest Colombia be interested in indicting them. And why? Why such a light penalty? Because the paramilitaries are aligned with the United States. In fact, the U.S. invented them. In 1962, General William Yarborough went to Colombia and he encouraged the creation of the paramilitary forces that continue to haunt that country and commit 80% of their human rights abuses. And so all of this is being done according to plan. So if a company is actually caught doing it, they have to be punished, but not so much because they're doing it for the greater good. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I hope this doesn't sound naive. I always vote a straight Democratic ticket, and I don't know what your advice is between Democrat and Republican, because you're pointing out, the bad on both sides, and anyway, that's my question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I tend to vote Democrat too for the same reasons you do. I think, though, number one, in 2020, there are some Democratic candidates who are better than others on this issue that I think I will be supporting, certainly. But no matter who you support, I think the key is, once you cast your ballot, your job is not done, right? I mean, you have to put pressure on your government representatives, on the president to do the right thing. And I think, again, with Obama, that's a mistake that the left made. They went to sleep, and he did awful things, and they never held him accountable. And ironically, with Trump, I'll be honest, some of the good things he wanted to do, liberals have opposed. They opposed him making friends with Russia. They opposed him leaving Syria. We have to be principled people. If a Democrat does something that's bad, it's bad. If a Republican does something good, it's good. We obviously have to decide for yourself what bad and good are, but the point is, we can't support things just because our party does it. And I think that is a huge mistake that Americans make, particularly when it comes to war and peace. If you look at the wars that have been started over the years, the Democrats have been behind a lot of them. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, again, the invasion of Libya, the beginning of the war in Yemen, which is probably the most catastrophic war in human history, in which millions of people are going to die. And yet that was started by Obama.
I didn't think we were responsible for starting the war in Yemen. I thought Saudi Arabia did, and we provided aid.
Well, that's true.
We did not start it.
Yeah, it's a fair point, but he started supporting them, and what is very clear is Saudi Arabia could not have prosecuted that war without our help.
Right.
Yeah, the U.S. has been refueling their bombers in midair, providing them with weaponry, including cluster bombs, and helping Saudi Arabia with the blockade, the naval blockade of Yemen, which is starving people out. So I would say we did start the war with them. I mean, they could not have done it without our critical help, and they couldn't keep doing it without our critical help. And under the law, we would be an accomplice to murder, which is treated, as I know being a lawyer, and from law school, you're treated the same as being the murderer, right? And so really, we have the same culpability as Saudi Arabia for that. Yeah.
I hate to stay on Colombia, maybe not your main point of being here, but I'm a little confused about what happened after the peace accords. And I thought that things were, it sounds like the paramilitary is as bad as ever, and I don't know what FARC is and all of this? I know there's another.
Yeah, no, it's an important question, and it relates to Venezuela. In a way, I mean, first of all, we have to remember something when we think about Chavez and his role in history, and Fidel as well, that they were critical in the peace accords in Colombia. One, they convinced the FARC, the leftist guerrillas, to seek peace. You know, they were very important. What Fidel said, what Chavez said was very important to them. And you know that every negotiation session that they held was in Havana. So the Cubans and Venezuelans were very critical for that. But one reason I point that out is because what's happening now with Venezuela, with the U.S. trying to use Colombia as a staging ground for the invasion of Venezuela, could not have happened if the FARC was still active. And they're not, because they've lived up to the peace accords, but the Colombian government is not. Nearly as soon as the Colombian government signed the peace accords, they reneged on it. One of the things the Colombian government was supposed to do under the peace accords was to rein in the paramilitaries. Instead, the paramilitaries are running amok, and they're now more powerful because they don't have the FARC to contend with, and so they're taking over territory the FARC used to have, and they're killing people in that territory. So now you have peace with the FARC. That exists. The FARC is disarmed. But you now have the paramilitaries, with the help of the military, fighting a one-sided war against the population. That's what's happening. So for the elite in Colombia and for the United States, this is the best of all worlds. This is incredible. And this is partly why the U.S. seized this opportunity against Venezuela. Because the FARC, if they still existed, would not have allowed the U.S. to be doing what they're doing in Colombia to attack Venezuela. So I think the FARC was hoodwinked in a certain sense, is the truth of it. And human rights, I think, are much worse now than they were. I mean, by statistics, they are, certainly. Yes?
So I had the pleasure of having dinner with Dan, and I'm always interested on the personal side of how people choose their lives to dedicate, like he has, his life to the defense of human rights. And so I was going to ask you if you could share with the audience your personal story, what turned you into becoming what you have become most of your life.
Okay. Well, so I was raised in a very right-wing household. My parents are very right-wing, they're still Trump supporters. And they're also very devout Roman Catholics, which I was, I'm not now, but I was growing up. Which is significant because the first thing that began to change my mind about the world was the murder of Archbishop Romero in 1980. I was 12 years old at the time. And I remember it happening. And I was watching 60 Minutes one night. I was a real nerdy kid. My brothers and sister would be watching Wild Kingdom downstairs, and I go to my parents' bedroom and watch 60 Minutes. And they had a story about Romero being killed. And they suggested at that time that it was U.S.-supported forces that had done it. And this shook my world to the core. Because I believed that the U.S. was defending the world against the godless Reds, right? That we were defending Christianity and the church and the world. And this was the first fact that I ever learned that suggested maybe that wasn't true. And then, I'll tell you another anecdote. The first thing that got me interested in Central America, even before that, was I was at a little school in Milford, Ohio, right outside of Cincinnati. Little school, St. Andrews, little town, little school, had maybe 30 or 40 kids in it. And in the fall of 1979, I was 11, 2 Nicaraguans started at my school. And they were real big kids, real tall, which for Nicaraguans is strange. In fact, one of the kids became the center of our basketball team. They also spoke perfect English. And at some point during the year, I said, well, what brought you to the United States? And they said, well, our father was the president of Nicaragua, and he was overthrown in a revolution over the summer. They were the sons of Anastasio Somoza. And so this was an incredible thing that always kind of stuck in my mind. Well, eventually, like many people, as I got older, these things stuck in my mind, but I didn't know what to believe because, you read the mainstream press and it tells you one thing, and then you maybe read things in the alternative press tells you something else. So finally, one summer when I was in college, I was reading The Nation magazine, and they had an advertisement to do reforestation work in Nicaragua, which I did. So I went in September of '87 to Nicaragua, in Ocotal, which was on the Honduran border, in a war zone, and lived there for a month, did reforestation work. And I was sick as a dog for a month because the water, there was no clean water, right? The people lived, I just had never seen poverty like that, But what dawned on me during that month, what troubled me again, because I basically thought, even though I had my criticisms, I basically held the view that the U.S. was this force for good in the world. But when I was in Nicaragua, I could not square that with the fact that my country was beating up this tiny country of like 2.5 million people, and the poorest people you're ever going to see. And I was like, this isn't the country I believed in. We're supposed to defend these people, not attack them. And it just blew my mind, and that changed my life. Really, I came home and I became very radical, and I got arrested for the first time doing civil disobedience work in Chicago. That Christmas, about 2 days before Christmas, I was arrested with Kathy Kelly, her, singing political Christmas carols in downtown Chicago. One went something like, away in El Salvador, death squads abound. My parents kicked me out of the house after that. But in any case, it was those experiences that really formed me. And I never looked back, and I promised myself, I really did, I promised myself and the people of Nicaragua that I would always oppose U.S. intervention. And I've tried to live up to that. Yeah. And by the way, can I just say that Jill here, who I had dinner with, and I kept thinking, I know this person. And I realized that I met her in 1988. She was translating for President Ortega at the time. And I met Ortega, and there she was. And I called my wife and I said, I think in our attic there's a framed photo, and you'll see her in it. Send me that picture. We did verify it's you. So that's pretty neat.
So there's my 15 seconds of fame. What has really impressed me with what's happened in Venezuela and Nicaragua recently is how the human rights authorities have kind of followed like the mainstream press, turning the truth on its head. And particularly I'm thinking of Amnesty International and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is an agency of the Organization of American States. So I wonder if you could share your thoughts on that.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think the second organization you mentioned is pretty easy to attack. The Organization of American States has been pretty bad for most of its history, right? It never said anything about Batista or Somoza, for that matter, in Nicaragua, right? During the 2002 coup against Chavez, remember that? The U.S. supported a coup once against Chavez, in which he was kidnapped and taken to a military base. OAS said nothing about that. That was none of their concern. OAS, frankly, except for a little break during the height of the pink tide in Latin America, the OAS has been a tool of the U.S. And so I'm not surprised so much about its current thing. Amnesty International is an interesting case. All these human rights groups are. And let me tell you, so I teach international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. So I will say that as a preface to what I'm about to say. These human rights groups are problematic in certain ways. I'm friends with Francis A. Boyle, who was on the founding board of Amnesty International USA. He teaches international human rights at the University of Illinois. He ended up leaving Amnesty International, very critical of them. For example, he condemns them for spreading the lie in 1990 about the claim that Saddam's forces were throwing Kuwaiti babies on the floor and killing them. Do you remember that? That was a lie. Never happened. It's a big casus belli of the invasion of Iraq. Amnesty International pushed that lie. And they also helped push some of the lies against the war against Libya as well in the run-up to the war. The point being, these human rights groups have been very treacherous, I believe, in terms of paving the way for Western intervention in these countries. And they do it for several reasons. One is they take the position, even though, and I'm not going to go a lot into this, but let me just say that the UN Charter, which arose after World War II, the Nuremberg trials, the main ill it was created to cure was war. Not human rights issues, war. They saw war as the font of all the abuses you could think of, right? Including the Holocaust. If you think about the death camps, those weren't in Germany. They were in other countries like Poland. Hitler couldn't have done what he did unless he'd invaded these other countries. And the point of the UN Charter was to prevent aggressive war like that, which Hitler engaged in, which is largely forgotten. But human rights groups, modern human rights groups, at best take no position on whether one country should invade another. Amnesty International openly said, with the run-up to the war in 2003 with Iraq, we take no position on whether you go to war. Our only position is once you go to war, be nice to each other. Well, that's absurd. It's absurd. We know, and the founders of the UN Charter and the judges at Nuremberg knew, once you start a war, torture ensues, and genocide ensues. Despite all the rules we have on war, none of them are followed, right? So the main thing you do is you prevent a war. Well, these human rights groups, they don't see themselves as doing that. But the other thing is Francis A. Boyle, again, who was on the founding board of Amnesty International USA, mentions, their primary goal isn't even to promote human rights. He listed like 4 or 5 goals before that. He said, one is fundraising. Right? And 2 related to that is essentially influence peddling, having and making influence and making relationships in Washington, which also help them fundraise. And 3 is, improving their publicity and their standing in the public and in the press, again, to help them fundraise. And somewhere at 4 or 5 is actually promoting the human rights. But the other 3 and 4 swallow up that human rights. Because in order to make money, they're not getting money from poor people in Nicaragua. They're getting money from the Ford Foundation, and from the U.S. State Department, and from USAID. Right? They're getting money from people who want to go to war. And in fact, Human Rights Watch Up till recently, they may still, but the last I checked, on their board was a former commander of NATO. These people are so locked in to the Washington establishment for purposes of both influencing and making money that I think it clouds their judgment as to how they see these other countries. If they don't, frankly, cook the books in order to promote whatever the State Department happens to want at a particular time. And I'm very wary of those organizations for that reason. In fact, at one point, Amnesty International, the head of the Amnesty International USA, was a woman who helped promote the war in Libya. And I forget if she was in the U.S. State Department. But that's the other thing, that there's a lot of the revolving door. There's this huge revolving door between these NGOs, including human rights NGOs, and the U.S. government. You know, one guy, I actually applied for his job once. It was my dream to be a human rights lawyer at one point, before I realized what that meant. But I interviewed with something called the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights in New York City with a guy named Michael Posner. And he really didn't like the cut of my jib at all, very quickly. He ended up getting a job in the State Department under Obama and apologizing for, our war in Syria. I mean, and now where is he? He's back in the human rights field. Again, very typical. So the same people who are running our foreign policy, the same people who are supposed to be the watchmen of our foreign policy. It doesn't work that way, or it doesn't work well, Anyway, that's my 2 cents.